to the motherfucking relay where we're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. Well, very recently, Sports Illustrated's Chris Mannix sat down with Fox executive Bill Wanger.
Who's that?
A guy who's a big part of what's going on over there between the PBC and Fox. And there were many revealing insights into just what the PBC plans to do moving forward.
Such as?
How they plan to deal with certain situations in relation to other outfits, other fighters that are fighting on other networks, and much of what you heard
from Wanger
during this podcast, because this was on Chris Mannix's podcast, much of what you heard coming directly from Bill Wanger is what I've been telling you all along in regards to the PBC, their island policy, and how in many ways they seek to isolate themselves from the rest of the world of boxing, because boxing is a world sport. It's not limited to what Fox can give you. It's not limited to what's going on in the United States. It's a world sport that features fighters from all around the world that have ties to many different outfits that fight on several different networks, thus isolating
all their fighters
yourselves, you know, the PBC isolating themselves from the rest of the world of boxing.
You've heard, obviously, the clamoring for Errol Spence versus Terrence Crawford over the last couple of years, really. At this point, is that the only way though to get it done, to be doing those types of cross promotions?
I mean, we don't look at it like that. I think we're the PBC and Fox have all the most of the top 99% of the top fighters. Yes, there's a few on some other platforms, but we're totally self-sufficient.
Well, it's not exactly rudimentary to growing the sport. Quite honestly, it does the opposite of that. You can't grow the sport when you seek to isolate yourselves from the rest of it. But that's very much what the PBC means to do.
Look, again, Errol has he's got to take care of business inside the PBC family. And again, once he does that and the time is right and he wants to fight Terrence Crawford, they'll make the fight.
The kind of way that the broadcast operates, where I mentioned Terrence Crawford and not mentioning Terrence Crawford on the broadcast, really kind of, I don't want to say pretending he doesn't exist, but not putting him front and center as a true top guy in the welterweight division. What's the thinking behind that?
Well, I one of the issues with boxing is the alphabet soup of belts. And, when we put up a graphic, we're putting up what we feel are the most important belts.
In a very roundabout way, what Bill Wanger has effectively communicated is that the people over there at Fox and the PBC, they don't place any importance, any emphasis, any priority on making fights like Crawford versus Spence. Even though there is a public outcry, a public demand for that fight, the PBC don't care, and Fox don't care. So don't expect to see it happen. And I've been telling you this for weeks and months, that if that fight hasn't gotten anywhere and isn't going to, you can thank the people over there at the PBC and you can thank the people over there at Fox. Because while outfits like Top Rank and Matchroom are willing to work together in cross-promotional, cross-network situations to make sure that the best are fighting the best, the PBC is not of that school of thought. And what they're actively seeking to do is isolate themselves from everyone else. Even though boxing is a world sport, even though boxing is not limited to what Fox and the PBC can give you, that's how they want to do it. That's how they want to play it. So if certain fights don't happen, you know who's culpable. You know who's responsible.
You know what we're going to try to do with the PBC, and we're on our way to do this, and as things fall into place, we are going to have a PBC belt and a PBC champion, let's say, of the heavyweight division. So play this out. Andy Ruiz beats Anthony Joshua again, and eventually you have Andy Ruiz and Deontay Wilder fighting for the PBC heavyweight title. You could do that potentially in the welterweights. You could do that at 154 pounds. You could do that at 168 pounds.
Now, Bill Wanger basically confirmed something that we've touched on here on the channel several times already, that the PBC is looking to cook up their own version of a title. I can't call it a world title because it wouldn't be a title that's being contested at the world level. Thus, it cannot be characterized as such, but better still, they are looking to cook up their own version of some kind of a championship. In a sport where you hear it all the time, there's too many belts out there already. What these guys want to do is add another one to the equation. Ask yourself a question, boxing fans. How in the flying fuck does this help the sport along? How does that help grow the sport? No actuality, it doesn't. And all it really does, all it really denotes, is yet another chapter in the same book, that the PBC is looking to isolate themselves from other fighters, other outfits, other networks, by cooking up their own version of a title that their fighters can fight for. In that way, they may never cross paths with what other fighters, the sport of boxing, the global sport of boxing, has to offer. You know that the alphabets, they get a lot of criticism. They do. Because a lot of them have sketchy history and questionable business practices. But one essential function that all these different alphabet titles perform, one function that actually is conducive towards the sport of boxing, that either the WBA, the WBC, the IBF, or the WBO, one essential function that they perform is they provide the segue for different fighters that are from different parts of the world and they're with different outfits. They provide the segue for these fighters to compete against each other at the world level. That's saying that you can have a domestic fighter from the United Kingdom climbing up the IBF's rank standings to challenge what champion may be the IBF champion. And that champion, he might be a guy from somewhere else in the world that's with another outfit. But what these organizations help to do is to close the circuit and provide that segue to make boxing a world sport. Well, that's not what the PBC wants.
Been saying it.
They don't want to have to cross paths with anybody else's talented fighters, anybody else's prospects, anybody else's champions. We see they're trying to freeze out Terrence Crawford, so that answers that question. They don't want PBC guys crossing paths with somebody else's guys. So what they'll do is cook up a made-up belt that's completely of their own design. It's not a world title because it's not being contested at the world level, but it will allow them to continue to keep everything in-house. It's a very selfish approach to what is a global sport. If the sport is to stay a global sport, to where world titles are being contested at the world level by fighters from all around the world, well, having an in-house title that other fighters from around the world can't win, unless they're PBC fighters, well, that would be a meaningless trinket, a meaningless designation. I mean, you're not a world champion if you're holding a PBC title, because PBC doesn't represent the world of boxing. It only represents the PBC of boxing, what many people would characterize as a cancer in boxing, as many of their business practices only service their own best interests, and they're not actually helping to grow the sport globally and make it accessible to everyone, making their fighters accessible to everyone, as to keep the best fighting the best in the world of boxing, not just the PBC of boxing. The only real silver lining, and I've said this before, in regards to the PBC potentially cooking up a title of their own that their fighters can fight for, is if at some point you got PBC guys fighting for nothing but PBC titles, well, that's less guys holding major titles hostage. You don't got to worry about the WBA, the WBC, the IBF, or the WBO being all tied up with a PBC fighter who's holding it hostage and won't unify it and won't defend it against fighters from another outfit. You don't have to worry about that if that fighter's fighting for a PBC trinket. That's the only real silver lining. You know, if there was anything good that could be derived from that statement from Bill Wanger, it would be that if PBC fighters are fighting for PBC titles, well, the major ones won't get held hostage. You know that Chris Mannix asked Bill Wanger, what's this WBO situation? Why does it seem like the PBC is hell-bent on disavowing all knowledge of the WBO and what fighters are champions via that organization?
You know, I one of the issues with boxing is the alphabet soup of belts. And, you know, when we put up a graphic, you know, we're putting up what we feel are the most important belts. And, you know, to us, that's WBA, WBC, and IBF.
Okay, but you put Pacquiao's secondary title up there, which is not real at all, when he fought Thurman. Like that.
Well, it was in a secondary position, so.
I mean, like, I'm not asking you to become a belt, you know, expert, but I mean, the WBO is no different than WBA is the worst of them all.
Why don't you look up the history of the WBO?
You can look them all. The IBF was raided by the FBI.
I'm not going to say anything about these individual belts, but the traditional belts, the ones that have been around the longest, are the ones that we are going to recognize within our broadcast.
Okay, but if a PBC fighter gets the WBO belt at some point, you will not recognize that belt.
There is no PBC fighter fighting in the WBO, as far as I know.
They are not. I don't know if they're any ranked or not. I'm not sure how that.
They're not ranked in there.
Not okay. But if it comes to it, let's say, for example, Jamal Charlo fought Demetrius Andrade. Like, that's a WBO title. If he won that.
You know that Bill tried to cite their sketchy history, their sketchy dealings, and if we're going to mull over the sketchy history of the WBO, we'd have to then mull over the sketchy history of the WBA, the WBC, and the IBF. I mean, none of these organizations are saints. They're all flawed. Many of them are imperfect. Even the IBF, which is held by many as the gold standard as far as how a sanctioning body should function these days, even they had a sketchy past. They were investigated by the Federal Bureau of Investigations, and this is how you can explain their very by-the-book approach these days. That was a long time ago. It was a different world. But better still, if these guys have got their act straight, it is because of their sketchy history. So, I mean, if you're gonna air out the WBO's dirty laundry, you'd have to air out everyone else's, and what you would find is that none of these organizations are perfect. None of them are saints. So trying to disavow the WBO as an organization on that premise is folly.
It's pure bullshit.
It's ridiculous. The WBO is no more sketchy than the WBC, but you recognize them, right?
Right.
The WBO is no more sketchy than the WBA, but you recognize the WBA, right?
Right.
So call it what it is. You're not recognizing the WBO because you don't want PBC guys having to deal with the likes of a Terrence Crawford. That's what it really is.
That's why you're doing it.
I guarantee you. If the likes of a Canelo Alvarez were holding a WBO title, oh, I bet you they'd recognize it then. I bet you they would make an exception in that situation. So we see how very specific the PBC is in what they choose to disavow or not disavow. If it was Canelo Alvarez holding that WBO title at 154 or 160 or 168 or 175, do you think their fighters would cease from calling him out? No, they'd still try to call him out because those parasites can't get the kind of paydays that he provides on their own. They can't do it. They can't do it with anybody else. They can't do it in-house. So for Canelo, if Canelo was a WBO champion, I bet you they'd recognize it then. But when it comes to Terrence Crawford, who's a fantastic fighter, amazing fighter, world champion in 3 weight classes, undisputed champion, the last American male undisputed champion the sport of boxing has seen. Comes to this guy, he's too risky for their fighters, and the rewards that a fight with him yields aren't enough that they would risk it all against him. They don't want to put Errol Spence in there with him, as invested as they are in Errol Spence. They don't want to put him in there with Crawford because for them, the rewards don't match the risks.
You know, the PBC has a stacked welterweight division, and there are plenty of fights that Errol can have well before he needs to fight Terrence Crawford. And again, if Errol and his team have a desire to fight Terrence Crawford, a deal can be made.
Well, it's stacked, but he already went through the top guy, or at least the Sean Porter, and that he's presumably going to fight
There's Danny Garcia,
which is next.
Manny Pacquiao.
Come on, we all know Manny's not going to fight him. Let's all be realistic on this one. Like he'd have to have more money thrown at Pacquiao than. I'm just basing this from Pacquiao conversations. This is like his camp, this side of the street. They don't seem all that interested in that type of fight. You disagree?
Chris Mannix isn't lying. Not but a few months ago. Both Boo Boy Fernandez, Manny Pacquiao's longtime friend, who now trains him, helps to train him at least, and Sean Gibbons, Manny Pacquiao's manager, they let it be known that they're not looking at the winner of Porter versus Spence. They're not looking at Spence. They're not. They don't even think he deserves the fight. They let it be known that they're looking at either Mikey Garcia or Danny Garcia, 2 guys who I'm positive are looking back. Okay? Mikey already did what he could do with Errol, and Danny's not going to prioritize fighting Errol over fighting Manny if Manny actually is receptive, reaching out, and means to iron out a fight. He'll pick Manny over Errol, the same way that Keith Thurman did. So in that way, it's not a foregone conclusion that Manny fights Errol Spence, and if he doesn't, Manny's fans will forgive him, because Manny's an aging champion. Okay, that's the reality of it. Throughout this podcast, you kept hearing Bill Wanger say that, if Errol Spence wants it, if his team wants it, in reference to the Crawford fight, as if it is his decision to make. But in that way, if it's his decision to make, and it's up to Errol, then we know why the fight hasn't happened yet, and we know why it's not going to. It's because Errol don't want it. In so many words, Errol don't want it with Crawford. Okay? Bill Wanger wasn't repeating that shit for no fucking reason. Errol Spence is not under an exclusivity contract with either Fox or Showtime. That's not how things work over there at the PBC. The fighters don't have exclusivity contracts. So in that way, Errol Spence could travel for that fight, and the fight would be just as big if he traveled to ESPN, if not bigger, than it would be if he had it on Fox or Showtime. So in that way, the networks aren't necessarily the problem. The problem is that Errol doesn't want it, and he's hiding behind these sides of the street argument. I tell you in truth that there isn't much here that we haven't discussed already. So now we try to achieve some kind of resolution, reconciliation, some kind of catharsis for many of the issues that we're already fully acquainted with. And it is that you cannot view PBC fighters as world-level fighters because that is what they are not. Thus, whenever you see one of them call out some guy that's on some other side of the street, don't read anything into it. All it really is clout chasing. The same clout chasing that we see from Gervonta Davis on a regular basis. You see Luis Nery
Calling out Inouye.
talking about a Naoya Inoue fight, but we know that Luis Nery's with the PBC and Naoya Inoue is not. He's with Top Rank now. So you calling him out in light of
Side of the street.
Bill Wanger's recent comments, that basically lets the cat out of the proverbial bag. That you're calling him out, but in all likelihood the fight don't happen. And you know that. So why are you calling him out? Why are you using his name? I'll tell you why. It's because nobody else at the lower weights is getting quite the same attention that he is. Not even you. So all you can do to get some kind of accord for whatever the fuck it is you're doing, whoever the fuck it is you're fighting, all you can do is try to use his name. You know that he's on a side of the street that you simply will not go. But you'll use his name anyway to keep yourself in the conversation and try to get some attention. Try to raise your marquee value by siphoning his attention, over to you. That way, these guys are barnacles, these guys are parasites, these guys are clout chasers. And the same is true, the same rings true with just about any PBC fighter that finds themselves calling out any other non-PBC fighter. Because if you're calling out a non-PBC fighter, we know you're not going to go over to their side of the street, so why the fuck are you calling them out? I'll say most, but not all, most of these PBC guys are gimmick guys. They're niche fighters. The same way that Wilder called out Joshua all that time, but never actually fought him. Lara called out Golovkin all that time, but never actually fought him. Davis has called out everyone from Lomachenko to TJ Dillashaw to Josh Taylor. He's not going to fight any of them. It's a gimmick. That's what it is. PBC is an organization. They're all gimmicks, smoke, and mirrors. That's what they are.